This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Jian Yang, and Dr. Yang is an assistant professor of forest landscape ecology in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Good. And Dr. Yang's research involves broad-scale environmental and ecological questions that are closely related to forest landscape ecology, ecosystem modeling, wildland fire science, and climate change. And before we get started at talking about his work today with landscape ecology, tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at UK.
Okay, as a university professor, I do teaching and research. I teach 2 courses at the UK. One course is to teach undergraduate students how to conduct spatial analysis with ArcGIS, which is Geographic Information System software. And the other course I'm teaching is the spatial analysis landscape ecology for the graduate students. And my research is primarily about understanding the patterns and the processes of a forest landscape. There is a saying in English as see the forest for the trees, which means that to detect a big picture from the details. Imagine that you are walking through a forest and you may observe a lot of trees on the way through through in the forest. And even though you are a very good observer and you may actually find a lot of the very interesting things about those trees, you still may not be able to grasp a good understanding of what this forest is. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you need to back up a little bit to actually to see the entire picture. And this is what I think that forest landscape ecologist is doing as well. So I consider my research is an endeavor to see the landscape for the forest mm-hmm. instead of see the forest for the trees.
Okay.
So what first got you interested in forestry and natural resources?
Well, I had my bachelor degree in geography, mm-hmm. and of course there are 2 particular courses I really liked. One is the geospatial technology. I like to do the spatial analysis with the GIS and then doing the satellite image analysis using the remote sensing scales. And then second thing that I liked was the biogeography. So that is kind of related to the kind of the forest landscape ecology. Mm-hmm. And then I began to pursue my graduate program, particularly the PhD in the forest landscape modeling, which is to understand how the forest landscape is changing over time in response to different kind of forces, environmental forces, such as, say, the disturbances like a wildfire, insect outbreak, and then we need to look at these forest dynamics over a broader scale and over a longer time period, because forest is considered like a kind of ancestral and it's like a static condition in a very short time period, but mm-hmm. over longer time period it changed dramatically, mm-hmm. Particularly due to what we call succession, right? So then the forest can change from like a pioneer early succession of forest to the kind of the old growth late succession of forest. And then when we needed to use some kind of the computer simulation models to actually to look at how the forest is changing over that kind of longer time period. So that's what I was doing during my PhD study. Mm-hmm. And over that kind of the past 10 years or 20 years, I began to actually put all the pieces together, not only just like the modeling component, but also to use the field ecology to understand how the different components in the forest landscape work together to shape the patterns that we observe at a large scale.
Oh, that's great.
Great.
Well, thank you. Thank you for telling us about your background. And now we're going to talk a little bit more about landscape ecology. Can you explain what is landscape ecology?
Okay, I teach this landscape ecology class, and each time I ask the students, I get kind of a different understanding about what a landscape ecology is. But first, I think that we need to understand what ecology is. So ecology is basically the study of the relationship between organisms and the environment the organisms are living through. So this ecology can be studied at different scales. At a very small scale, let's say at the scale of an individual organism, then we can study the relationship of that particular individual with its environment. That is what we call autoecology, and that is basically just to study, well, what kind of the optimal conditions, such as what is the optimal light, water, and the nutrient conditions for that organism to live the best. And then at a larger scale, such as, say, at a forest stand scale, there are not just one individual tree. There are, like, say, 20 or 100 trees living in that stand. And so then we need to look at the interaction of those multiple trees that are living within that particular stand and how those trees interact with the environment. So we get to the so-called population ecology and also community ecology. So population ecology is to study the trees that belong to the same species, and the community ecology is a study of the trees or organisms that belong to different species. So that is the kind of the traditional perspective of how ecology can be studied in different scales. But we also need to study at an even bigger scale than that kind of traditional scale that I just mentioned. And that big scale is called the landscape scale. And at a landscape scale, there are multiple populations, multiple communities, and they are actually interacting each other at that larger spatial context. So we want to understand the patterns that is being created by those different populations and the communities at that landscape scale, and also how that pattern is affecting some very important processes, particularly ecological processes. So to sum that up, so landscape is a relatively larger scale in which there are a great amount of spatial heterogeneity. And the landscape ecology is the study of the organism and the environment at the landscape scales.
Okay, good.
Right?
So how large is large enough for a spatial entity to be considered a landscape?
Well, there is no definitive answer to that question.
Okay.
Just like a watershed, when we talk about the watershed, you can say that a headwater watershed, which can be just several, let's say several acres, or less than 20 acres. That's a headwater watershed. But we can also talk about a watershed like as big as the Mississippi River Basin.
Okay.
So landscape is similar to that, because when we talk about landscape, we really think about a kind of a context in which there are different elements or different patches. So as long as there is an important spatial heterogeneity that we need to consider, we may consider that as a landscape. But for me, I'm studying the forest, and when I talk about a forest landscape, the size of that forest landscape can vary from, say, 100 acres to million acres.
Oh, okay.
Okay, depends on the research questions that we are taking, we are addressing.
Okay.
So, what kinds of research questions are being studied in landscape ecology?
Okay, so the central theme of landscape ecology is the interaction of spatial patterns and ecological processes. So, as I said earlier, a landscape is a spatial entity that is large enough with a great amount of spatial heterogeneity. And sometimes we consider the landscape is a mosaic of different patches with clear boundaries. So each patch has its own unique environmental and biological characteristics that are different from the surrounding area, right? And so then a landscape has these kind of so-called distinctive spatial patterns, and we want to know what kind of processes are responsible for creating such spatial patterns at this landscape scale. And consequently or subsequently, we are also interested in how those spatial patterns may affect the processes, particularly the ecological processes. So that is the central theme of landscape ecology. And I can give you a specific example here.
Okay.
So in Rocky Mountains, Rocky Mountains has a very high elevation, right? So and then there are different kind of forests that are occurring along these elevational gradients in the Rocky Mountain. At the lower elevation, there are so-called ponderosa pine forest, and at the higher elevation, there are so-called subalpine forest. So in the lower elevation, the ponderosa pine forest has very thick bark, and traditionally, those forests has very sparse sand density, very low density. So generally, historically, you can actually say, well, ride the horse through that forest. Right. Then at the higher elevation, there is subalpine forest. The tree species are like the lodgepole pine, then subalpine fir, and some spruce. And those kind of forests has a very high fuel accumulation, because if you think about those, like particularly fir and spruce, they have so-called ladder fuel. So the tree branches can go from the top of the canopy all the way to the ground vertically. And so when there's a fire, the fire can burn very easily from the ground to the canopy. So when we actually look at the forest in Rocky Mountains, we can clearly see there's a spatial variation. The different forests in the lower elevation and high elevation. And that spatial pattern is created by the interaction of 5 major forces or drivers. The first one is climate, the second one is the landform or topography, and the third one is disturbance, and then the fourth one is land use, the fifth one I call biological competition or biological interaction. So in this particular example, the lower elevation and the high elevation have very different climate. Like subalpine region is really cold because the elevation is high. And this is what I call the interaction of the climate and the landform. Right? So that is the major driver of the spatial pattern that we observe. And however, that spatial pattern that we observed are also working closely with the wildfire disturbance. And as I just said, that at the lower elevation, the ponderosa pine has very thick bark. So and also the sand density is low. So that when the fire occurs, generally those fires are considered low severity. Fires that do not kill those ponderosa pine, because those ponderosa pine have very thick barks. So, but the fire does kill those understory shrubs. So actually, that's a good thing to maintain that kind of open canopy forest structure. But in the higher elevation, then because of the ladder fill, so once there's a fire, the fire can change from the low intensity ground fire to the high intensity canopy fire very easily. So in that higher elevation, the fire, we generally consider those fires as a standard replacement fire. Once there's a fire occurs, the fire will kill all the trees or most of the trees in those areas. And that is actually also a good thing for the regeneration of some trees, dominant tree species over there. Like some pine species, like lodgepole pine, is considered so-called serratinous, meaning that the cones of those pines are generally closed. And there's like some kind of resin or oil that actually then basically protect the seeds. And then the cones will pop up during a fire because of the high intensity, and then the seeds will be released. And because the fire killed all those trees, so there's no competition for the seeds to establish and to regenerate. So as you can see that at the landscape scale, we see the kind of the distinctive spatial patterns created by those 5 major forces, and that spatial pattern also affect what kind of the fire would occur on the landscape and how that fire would actually affect the biological communities. So that is a good example of how the spatial pattern and the ecological process are interacting each other and influencing the pattern that we observe on the landscape.
Good.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. This is Dr. Matt Springer. I'm an Assistant Extension Professor of Wildlife Management within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources here at University of Kentucky. I'm here to teach you a little bit about the animals that live in our forests, especially those here in Kentucky. For those of you who might just be joining us, each week we'll play a wildlife sound from our forest. Here's our sound for this week. Stay tuned. Towards the end of the show, we'll talk about this animal and why it is making that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
So why is the study of landscape ecology important to the United States or even globally?
Well, that's because the scale matters when we try to understand the ecology. As I mentioned in the beginning, that the ecology or the relationship between organism and the environment can be studied at different scales. Traditionally, we have studied at the individual organism scale, at the population scale, at the community scale, and then we actually also study at the ecosystem scale. But then we began to realize that there are multiple ecosystems that can potentially interacting each other at a larger spatial scale. So to help us understand this kind of many environmental issues that we are facing, we needed to study this at a larger scale, in this case a landscape scale. Another important thing to consider when we actually say, well, why it is important to study landscape ecology is because most management planning are actually developed at a landscape scale. Right? Develop a master plan for a forest, a national forest, and then that national forest is a big block. Right? So you need to consider, well, a landscape approach to manage that forest. And why I call that is a landscape approach? Because as I said that for that big forest, that a national forest, you could have different forest types within that national forest.
Oh, okay.
Right, so you could have, say, like in our case, we could have some oak dominant forest, then some maple dominant forest, and then even say the forest had belong to the kind of the same community, we still have different structure or different age class, and so at a landscape scale, you could have the forest that are belonging to the same forest type, but still considered different in terms of its function because they have different forest structure. Some are young forests, some are the older forest. So when we develop a master plan to manage the forest, we need to consider, well, how much younger forest do we need? How much older forest do we need to sustain not only just say the timber production, but many other important management objectives. For example, the habitat, right? So some species require like an edge habitat or early successional forest habitat. Some species require the old growth forest as its own habitat. So you need to consider, well, at the landscape scale, how much old growth versus how much young forest is needed. So that's what we call multiple objective forest management, right? So you need to consider not just the timber, but also we need to consider habitat, biodiversity protection, and then something related to like the water conservation to protect the watershed. So we need to think about, well, at a landscape scale, well, which part or which location is very important to protect like the headwater. So what kind of forest should we actually grow or protect in that kind of important pathway where the water is collecting down to the streams, and also the forest health. Like when we consider the forest health, we need to consider it as protected or sustain it at a larger scale, because it's important to consider like different components of the forest that may actually facilitate the spread of certain pathogen, and therefore where do you want to protect, and maybe it's depend on like what's the critical pathway that the pathogen may spread on the landscape. So due to this kind of the multiple objective nature of our forest management, we need to consider the forest management from a landscape perspective.
Okay.
So that's what I meant, that the scale matters.
Yeah. And if you could explain a little bit to our listeners about old growth and new growth, what exactly would be the difference? I know it might be self-explanatory, but if you could explain a little bit between those.
Sure. And the old growth is a concept that's related to what I just said the succession, right? So consider that the forest was completely harvested, or the forest was burned by the wildfire, then there's an open land. However, then the early successional tree species, like poplar, yellow poplar, and then they will establish on that open field and grow very quickly. So that is what we call early successional forest. And as the time goes by, those tree species will be eventually replaced by some tree species that are more shade tolerant. So when I say shade tolerant, it means that those tree species can grow relatively well under the canopy.
Okay.
When the light is penetration, there's very little light penetrate to the middle story or understory. So the yellow poplar is actually they like the light, they love the light, so they can grow very well when there's an open field. and that's why we call early successional tree species. But then the other tree species, such as a maple, they can actually tolerate that kind of the shade. So they can still grow under the canopy of the yellow popular. So when the yellow popular reached its longevity and died, then those maple species, they can take over the canopy and become the dominant tree species in the forest. And during that stage, we call maybe, let's say, mid-successional or late successional forest.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So talk a little bit about landscape ecology here in Kentucky, kind of the importance and what you're studying.
Okay, so landscape are always unique, and I can think this is as actually, let's say, a perfect landscape is just like a perfect storm that is created by many factors that actually is just like a meaning, what is called, like a lot of the chances that are creating a unique landscape. Then those chances, what I meant is actually is the interaction of those 5 major drivers: climate, landform, disturbance, land use, and the biological interactions. So those 5 major drivers, they interact each other and then create very unique landscapes. And then in Kentucky, there are many unique, beautiful landscapes, right? So you have bluegrass landscape. You have actually in the eastern Kentucky, there's a deciduous forest, which is actually one of the most biologically diverse temperate forests in the world. And that kind of a biological diversity is created by the climate, the geology, and the topography. And if you just say go to the Cumberland Plateau in the East Kentucky, you see that the landscape is highly dissected. So meaning that within a very short geographic distance, you can see a lot of different landforms.
Okay.
And then like the west facing, south facing, very steep slopes. And so those are kind of the dissected landscapes can actually create a really different habitats at a very short geographic scale for those different kind of tree species to grow. And therefore, that kind of the landscapes are really unique, and it's fascinating to study those forest landscapes. And another thing is that, I want to mention on is that Kentucky, as a part of the eastern U.S., has been strongly influenced by the humans, right? So the human land use is really a major driving force that of the landscape that we observe right now nowadays. So to understand how that the social component or the human component, that how the influence of the human components on the landscape that we observe in Kentucky, I think is also important. So overall, the landscapes in Kentucky are unique and biologically important, and we just need to actually to study how to actually to preserve or protect those landscapes. Yeah.
Okay, so you have several graduate students that you're working with on this topic. So tell us a little bit about the research that they're working on.
Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about that. What are the kind of major driving forces of the Kentucky's forest landscapes? Okay. To me, I think that as I just mentioned, that the human has a strong influence on the eastern U.S. landscapes. And particularly, I consider that the land use and the disturbances are the two kind of the major driving forces of the forest landscapes that we saw. And when I say land use and the disturbances, what I meant in the eastern Kentucky is surface mining and the timber harvesting. Those are the two kind of major hard disturbances that I'm studying with my graduate students. So I have one of my ongoing research is to map the surface mining footprint in eastern Kentucky. So we know that the surface mining is a very pervasive disturbance in central Appalachia. And in many other states like West Virginia, there are a good research that has been showing mapping the what I call footprint of the surface mining. But we don't have that in Kentucky, right? So I have been working on with the graduate students and the department as a specialist to use like 35 years of the satellite images to look at in each year how much area that was active mining and how much area that was being reclaimed. And we can then look at like an annual change of those, like the surface mined area and the annual change of the reclamation area. And so that's one thing that we can get a better understanding the impacts, the cumulative impacts of surface mining on the entire eastern forest landscape, eastern Kentucky's forest landscape. And also, this study is important because we are not only look at this kind of aerial mapping, we also look at how the surface mining change topography, because as we all know that the surface mining has the procedure to like explode the mountains and or fill the valleys. So that changes the topography quite dramatically. So we have used the pre-mining elevation data and then post-mining elevation data to compare how surface mining is changing the topographic characteristics. And we also then link that to the habitat. So we quantified how much mountain tops have been lost due to the surface mining. And we also quantified what are the species that kind of prefer that kind of ridge tops as their habitat for certain stage of their for certain life stage of those species, like the winter winter hibernation.
Hibernation.
Yeah. So we are able to show not just the surface mining footprint, also the cascading ecological impacts in the say Eastern Kentucky's biodiversity. So that is one of the ongoing research. And also we use the so-called ecosystem service evaluation approach to assess the benefits we can gain from forest reclamation on those abandoned surface mining sites. So this is an important research in my mind, because in Kentucky, a lot of those abandoned surface mining sites were not reclaimed to the forest. Rather, they were reclaimed to kind of the grassland. It's, first of all, it's cheaper doing that way. And also that there's not much incentive or recognition of the importance of reclaiming the forest, reclaiming those surface mining sites back to the forest. And when we actually started this research, we are able to show that how much benefits that the human can gain by restoring those mining sites back to the forest, in terms of, well, how much carbon that can be sequestrated, then how much water can be conserved, because, and then how that can reduce or mitigate the flood risk that is maybe experienced by the people that our communities living downstream of those surface mine area. So we kind of use a tool to evaluate a suite of the ecosystem services that can be gained through this forest reclamation. So that's another research that I've been doing and kind of closely related to this surface mining. And it's for the timber harvesting, which I said that is another very important disturbance in East Kentucky forest. Well, that is a different kind of disturbance comparing to the surface mining, because surface mining, it has a very persistent long-term influence, right? So because it changes the topography, right? Yeah. And also the surface mining, it creates a different spatial pattern, and that's because the surface mining patches are generally bigger than the harvest patches, right? So harvest patches are really small comparing to those surface mining patches. However, there are a lot more harvest patches. So we need also to use we also need to understand the spatial characteristics of those harvest patches. How many each year that how many for harvest patches each year that the landscape has experienced, and what is the kind of the cumulative impacts of those patches, harvest patches on the landscape. So one of my students are working on the post-harvesting invasive species. So that is, I think that is a really important ecological impacts the timber harvesting may actually bring about or bring on to the landscape. So these students has worked in the Robinson Forest, and within the Robinson Forest there are a large scale experiment that has removed, not removed, it has actually been manipulated to cut the trees with three small small watersheds, and we are looking at how the invasive species are spreading in those watersheds after the timber harvesting, and then compare that pattern that we observe within those harvest watersheds with the pattern that we surveyed in an adjacent uncut watershed. So what we found is that within those harvest watersheds, the invasive species can occur from 70% to 90% of the surveyed plots. In contrast, in the uncut watershed, which we call a control watershed, then the invasive species only observed like 20% of the plots. So you see that there's a big increase in terms of the occurrence of the invasive species after the harvesting.
And can you tell the listeners why that is? Why do invasive species come into kind of freshly cut areas?
Well, when the that's because when the watershed was freshly cut, then there is as just mentioned earlier, there's a open canopy condition. So the light is reaching the ground, and then many invasive species are what we call early successional species. They like the abundant light. So when there are a lot of light, those species can come in, establish, colonize, and then begin to spread on the entire landscape.
And which ones are you looking at for that area? What are some of the species that are coming in?
Well, there are Japanese stilt grass. There are tree of the heaven. So the Japanese stilt grass is a kind of grass, and then tree of heaven, of course, is a tree species. So there are different growth forms, right? And generally those grass species, invasive species, they are more persistent
Okay.
on the landscape. Once they are colonizing on the landscape, they will tend to actually to stay there for a very long time. And for the tree of heaven, but is actually as a tree, it would compete with other tree species. So it's actually a very fascinating thing that we are trying to look at is that over time, how different invasive species may actually change its abundance at the watersheds. And what we have seen for that particular experiment is that 1 year after harvesting, there are a lot of tree of heaven. But when we conduct the survey 8 years after the harvesting, the abundance of the tree of heaven got dramatically reduced.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, so that is an important thing because if we do the forest management and we may want to eradicate the tree of heaven, then you may consider, well, do we need to actually to do it right after harvesting, or can we wait for a while, let the biological competition do some of the job, then we can go over there and then eradicate the remaining the tree of heaven with a much less cost.
Right.
So that is one thing that we are interested in to look at, which is the temporal dynamics of those landscape spread of the IES, or I call it invasive exotic species. And also we look at the spatial characteristics, which part of the landscape is more likely to have those IES, right? So we are able to show that in those harvest watersheds in Robinson Forest, the west-facing gentle slopes tend to have higher likelihood of observing those IES. So therefore, when we actually start to think about, well, where do we find those invasive species when we're trying to actually to do the invasive species control, then we may need to actually to go to those aspects, the south-facing or west-facing aspects, where the environment tend to be warmer and slightly drier. So those are the conditions that we saw that are actually much more conducive to the invasive species. Yeah. So that's what I call the spatial characteristics part of this research. And another students that I've been working, another research that I've been working with my students is to actually to map the spatial distribution of tree species at the landscape scale. So this research is interesting because that student is interested in establishing the beehives in the recently reclaimed sites. In the sense that, we know that the surface mining would create a kind of a grassland because it would actually create some flat area, and after the mining is done, then they generally reclaim it to the grassland, and those grassland may be useful to the beekeepers. They can put their beehives in those grassland because there are a lot of cloves and the wildflowers, etc. But the beekeepers also like to collect the bees, the honeys from some particular specific tree species. That's like basswood, sourwood, and yellow poplar.
Okay.
And so these students, he's interested in identifying which part of the surface mining area is closer to those particular tree species, so that when he puts his beehives into those areas, then he would be able to collect the honey that is from those particular tree species, and that the price for those kind of honey are much higher
Okay.
than the regular honey. So we're using like the satellite images and then GIS to actually to map where is more likely to have those particular tree species that he's interested in, and then use the GIS to identify, well, within the perimeter of those surface mining area, which part of the perimeter is closer to those particular tree species, so that he can then be more successful to actually to get the those kind of the honey. So those are the kind of the research that I have been working on.
Oh, that sounds
Sounds
great.
interesting, yeah.
Oh, that's great. So I know that a lot of your research is collaborative. Who are some of your partners that you're working with?
Well, I work with many professors within the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, and I worked with Dr. Marco Contreras, who is a forest operation scientist, on using the LiDAR to actually to categorize the forest structure and use that as a predictor variable to better understand where the invasive species is more likely to occur. And I worked with many wildlife professors in our department to look at, well, say, what is the landscape characteristics of the bat habitats, and to look at what is the landscape, how surface mining might impact certain indicator species in Appalachia. And then I also worked with a watershed professor to actually to understand how the surface mining reclamation may change the ecosystem service provision, and how forestry reclamation may actually increase at the value of the ecosystem services. So yeah, I work with a lot of professors in the inside department. I also work with professors outside our department, and particularly I've been working with Dr. Karen Renee from the Community Development Department. And we are looking at both the natural and the human components of a forest landscape. So as I mentioned that, well, human in land use is really important, right, in driving the forest landscape. But we also want to understand how forest landscape may actually affect the human society, particularly like economics. And what we have been working on is that what we call the curse of the resource curse.
Oh, okay.
That is experienced in the Eastern Kentucky. You know that Eastern Kentucky, well, the people there, they have abundant resources, like the mineral resources and the timber resources. But the people there, in terms of the overall income, general income, is pretty low. So what we call this is called like a resource extraction economy dependency, and how that say the surface mining affect the ecological integrity of the forest landscape, and how that affects say water quality and etc. Then how that is actually really affecting the human society governance. So that's something that we are trying to piece all those puzzles together to really to find out what is the kind of the interactive influences of these ecological impacts and the human societal governance on that resource dependency economy.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, well, you've presented us with a lot of great information, and we appreciate that. What would be one or two takeaway items that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
All right, so I studied landscape ecology, so I just want to listen our listeners to actually to have a firm understanding or appreciation that landscape is a critical domain of the scale for us to understand many important environmental issues that we are facing in the world. and it's also a critical skill for the management. And in ultimately, to me, landscape is not just a context, but also a object with its own unique characteristics. And most importantly, landscape has aesthetic value. So where there are many beautiful landscapes that we want to preserve, that we need to appreciate. And I want the listener to actually to take home message with that.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Yang, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Welcome back to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. I'm Dr. Matt Springer, Assistant Extension Wildlife Professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. Before I tell you what that sound was you heard at the beginning of the show, let's play it again for you.
Okay, Matt, tell us what that sound was.
Sure. So that's a common bird we have in our backyards right now, and that's a Carolina chickadee. So they're a rather tiny bird with the black cap on their top of their head, the crown. And they're bouncing around everywhere right now, especially in my backyard. You pretty common sight within the Lexington area, majority of Kentucky. They're frequent visitors of bird feeders.
When you say tiny, like if you compared it to a robin.
Half the size or
half
smaller.
The size.
Yes.
Okay, wow.
Yes, they're a tiny little bird. But the reason I picked them is they have some really interesting behaviors and some cool things that go on with them and their anatomy relating to how they eat food. It's the winter months. Food is scarce. It's why they're coming to your feeders so regularly. But in other areas and outside of where feeders are, and chickadees actually have a really cool ability in the fall. They'll start growing their brain to remember where they store food in cache sites. So they're a species that caches food. So they make these little hideys that they put food in to save for later. And in order to remember where all those are, their brain actually grows up to 30% every fall and winter so that they can remember where those things are.
Wow, I wish we could do that, don't you, Laura?
Yeah, well, yes. And a lot of people wish they could do that, which is actually, they're really well studied by the medical field because they're looking at how that's happening within the certain part of the brain that controls memory. And then in the spring, after they use up those resources, the brain actually shrinks back to the size it was.
Wow.
So it's a kind of really neat thing that those birds do.
So what do they eat?
So chickadees are seed eaters. So for those who are feeding birds, they'll pick at soot, the sunflower seeds, basically your bird mix that you can buy in the store. They'll eat almost all of that. So there's a wide variety of seeds that they will consume, but pretty much if you have a seed out there, they're going to eat it.
Okay. Do they stay in this area or do they leave?
Sure. Chickadees are residents. They do have a little bit of migration potential there, but usually they're pretty localized. And we have so we're actually kind of on the line between two different species of chickadees. We have the Carolina chickadees predominantly, but their northern relative, the black-capped chickadee, you could actually have, if we have a big winter storm, we may see some of them come in the area. As well, and telling them apart is very difficult for most folks, and really it's about the song they sing in the spring that helps.
So if you're just looking out your back window, you're not going to know which one you're looking at. Probably.
Chickadee's a chickadee for us here.
Okay.
There's chickadees in other parts of the United States that do look a little different, but these guys are pretty much it's a chickadee. Okay. So, yep.
As far as their mating habits, do they stay with one partner, or do they change every year?
As with most birds, they are usually polygamous, and sometimes the eggs in one nest may not be from the same partner.
Oh, okay.
They have this strategy of spreading out the wealth, per se, and one male may be better than another male, so who knows? And we'll just let it all sort it out in its own way. So yeah, they definitely are just like most other birds in that fact.
So how long does it take for the eggs to hatch?
Somewhere around 20-ish days, 22 days, if I remember correctly. They will have multiple nests in 1 year, trying to ensure that they can produce as many as possible. And they start nesting about the same time as most other birds in late spring.
And do they use the same nest?
Most birds do not. That's actually like a bald eagle that will build on top of it. Most birds actually will rarely use the same nest over again, and that's because of parasite issues and disease issues. If you think about it, it's a potential for actually cultivating all those things, and it lowers the chances of survival for the chicks.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming in today. We appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky. If you have any questions about things that you heard on today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. This spring, we have a new show schedule. We're going to be on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon on WRFL 88.1 FM.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.